Environmental impact statements are supposed to protect our air, our water, our wildlife, and our communities. They're the legal shield we count on to stop destructive projects. But what if the system designed to safeguard the planet is quietly allowing some of the most damaging projects to move forward anyway? Today I'm exposing the real, documented flaws inside the environmental impact statement process, flaws that government audits, court rulings, and scientific reviews have been warning about for years. We're talking about buried health risks, minimized pollution numbers, corporate influence, and entire communities left in the dark. These aren't rumors. These are real cases, real evidence, and real consequences. Environmental impact statements aren't just paperwork, they read the last line of defense between ecosystems and irreversible harm. And right now, that line is full of holes. So today, we're exposing those holes, revealing the proof and showing you exactly what needs to change. Because if the system meant to protect the planet is broken, then it's up to us to fix it. So let's get into the first shocking truth. Environmental impact statements often minimize worst-case scenarios. Think about it. A company wants to build a new factory. The eyes they submit might focus on all the great modern pollution controls they plan to install. But what happens if those controls fail? What about the long-term slow-leaking contamination that might not show up for 20 years? Multiple academic reviews and government assessments have found that EIS documents frequently downplay these long-term risks. They underestimate the real amount of greenhouse gas emissions and present overly optimistic predictions about how well their mitigation plans will work. This happens because agencies are allowed to use projected models, not guaranteed outcomes. The result is a best-case scenario document that can feel more like a marketing brochure than a serious environmental analysis. Now this leads us directly to our second point, which is one of the most glaring conflicts of interest in the entire system. Developers often provide the data that justifies their own projects. Let that sink in. The company asking for approval is often the same one that funds and hires the consultants who write the draft EIS. It's like letting a student write and grade their own exam. Even though government agencies are supposed to review the work, government accountability studies have repeatedly called this a major structural weakness. How can a report be truly impartial when the people paying for it have a massive financial stake in its conclusions? It creates a powerful incentive to produce data that looks favorable, even if it doesn't reflect the full reality on the ground. And what about the public? Our voices are supposed to matter, right? Well, that brings us to truth number 3. Public participation is frequently rushed or limited. The law requires a public comment period, but in practice, it's often a procedural hurdle, not a meaningful dialogue. These comment periods can be incredibly short, sometimes just 30 or 45 days. Meanwhile, the technical documents can be over 1,000 pages long, filled with complex scientific jargon. How is an ordinary citizen, or even a small community group, supposed to read, understand, and provide informed feedback on something like that in just a few weeks? To make matters worse, public comments are not required to influence the final decision. This system disproportionately affects low-income communities and Indigenous groups, who often lack the legal expertise or financial resources to challenge these massive reports effectively. Their voices, the ones most often impacted, get drowned out. This brings us to one of the most shameful failures of the EIS process. Environmental justice impacts have been historically undervalued. For decades, these reviews either ignored or minimized the fact that pollution and industrial hazards are not distributed equally. They failed to adequately consider the disproportionate exposure to pollution in minority communities, the specific health impacts on children, or the cumulative burden on neighborhoods that are already surrounded by factories and waste sites. The problem was so widespread that in 1994, a presidential executive order was issued to force federal agencies to evaluate environmental justice. But even today, enforcement remains inconsistent. We continue to see polluting projects approved in communities that have already shouldered more than their fair share of environmental harm. The EIS was supposed to prevent this, but too often, it has enabled it. Next, let's talk about something called cumulative impacts. This is one of the most criticized weaknesses of the EIS system. A single project, when looked at in a vacuum, might seem acceptable. Maybe one new highway doesn't seem so bad. But what happens when you add that highway to an area that already has 3 factories, a landfill and a refinery? The combined effect of all these projects is almost never fully analyzed. The EIS process is designed to look at projects one by one, which completely misses the bigger picture. It's like judging the health of a forest by looking at a single tree. This piecemeal approach allows for a slow, creeping degradation of the environment, where no single project is held responsible for the total damage being done. It's a massive loophole, and polluters know how to exploit it. And what about the single biggest environmental threat of our time, climate change? You'd think it would be front and center in any environmental impact statement today. But for a long time it wasn't. This is our 6th hidden truth. Climate change impacts are often treated as secondary. Historically, many EIS reports would give climate change a brief mention but failed to deeply analyze it. They wouldn't calculate the full life cycle emissions of a project, from construction to operation to decommissioning. Often, the risk of climate change was dismissed as too uncertain to properly measure, which conveniently limited the project's accountability. This gap was so obvious and so dangerous that the federal government had to issue new guidelines emphasizing climate considerations. The fact that they had to do this proves just how flawed the old system was. Now for what might be the biggest shock of all. An environmental impact statement does not have veto power. That's right. An agency can approve a project even if the EIS shows it will cause major, undeniable environmental harm. This is a jaw-dropper for most people. We assume the whole point of the study is to stop bad projects. But legally, that's not its function. As long as the agency has followed the correct procedure, documented the potential harm, and considered alternatives, they can still give the green light. This means the EIS often functions as a procedural checkbox, a way for an agency to say, "We did the paperwork," rather than a genuine protective shield. It's a license to pollute, as long as you disclose that you're going to do it. Ironically, the EIS process gets criticized from both sides. Environmental activists argue it's too weak, while industry groups complain that it causes analysis paralysis and endless delays. This brings us to truth number 8. These delays are often used as a political weapon. It's true that some EIS reviews can take 4 or 5 years to complete. But while the bureaucracy churns, the environment on the ground may be continuing to degrade. More importantly, the narrative of delay is used by politicians and lobbyists to argue for weakening the rules. They frame environmental protection as an obstacle to progress, turning a tool for careful decision-making into a political football. The focus shifts from protecting our planet to complaining about paperwork. So let's say a project gets approved but with promises. The company says, "Don't worry, we'll restore the wetlands," or "We'll install filters to capture the pollution." These are called mitigation measures. And here's the 9th hidden truth. These promises are rarely followed up on. A well-known structural weakness of the system is that once a project is approved based on these promises, the follow-up monitoring to ensure they are actually implemented is often inconsistent or completely non-existent. Government audits have repeatedly flagged this problem. A project gets its permit, the construction begins, and the promises of mitigation can fade into memory. It's another way the system is built on trust, but lacks the teeth to enforce it. Finally, and perhaps most critically, we must talk about Indigenous land and treaty rights. For far too long, the EIS process has failed to respect tribal sovereignty. This is our 10th and final truth. Historically, many EIS reviews have failed to include tribal consultation early enough in the process, if at all. They have failed to properly evaluate the impacts on cultural resources and sacred sites, things that cannot be replaced or given a dollar value. This isn't just a procedural error. It's a violation of treaties and trust. It has taken major court cases, often led by tribes themselves, to overturn projects and force agencies to take these obligations seriously. It shows a deep systemic failure to recognize that these lands have a history and a cultural significance that predates any pipeline or highway. So, where does this leave us? We've seen how the EIS process can be manipulated, how it contains conflicts of interest, and how it often fails to protect the most vulnerable. But this isn't a story of despair. It's a call to action. These flaws are not secrets. They have been documented and criticized for years. Change is possible, but it requires public pressure. We need to demand stronger enforcement, independent data collection, and meaningful public and tribal consultation. We need laws that don't just disclose harm but actually prevent it. The system is broken, but it's not beyond repair. Thank you for watching, and if you believe in fighting for a healthier planet, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's demand better.